Hi everyone and welcome to another video. I'm lauranemacquart and today I'm going to talk about the books that I've read in the first half of March. Yes, we're in March. It feels like February went very fast and I didn't read that much, and somehow now in the past, we are the 14th, but as of yesterday I'd already read 7 books in these past 2 weeks. And in February I read a lot of big books, and somehow now I've been speeding up and reading a lot of smaller books, so that explains that number, but I'm still kind of in shock. So as usually, we're going to start with the books that I'm reading for the Invisible Cities project, that I won't go into depth about here because I'm going to talk about them more in the videos that I do for Invisible Cities separately. I've read 2 audiobooks. One is a non-fiction, which I read for Mexico, and it is Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions by Valeria Luiseli. It's non-fiction, and it's a kind of memoir-ish essay-y thing, where she talks about children from Mexico, from Honduras, from the countries in that neighborhood that flee to the US, and how the number of children has increased, and what their trip is like when they immigrate, where they flee their country, why they do that, and how they are treated when they arrive in the US. I think it was only 4-hour audiobooks. It was kind of short but very impactful. And I'd recommend it if you're interested in those topics, but you might want to wait for my video about Invisible Cities Mexico for that. And the other was for Iraq, for which I read Iraq 100 Plus, the first anthology of science fiction to have emerged from Iraq, and this was edited by Hassan Blassim. So I buddy read this with Paula from Draw Your Books, and as it says, it's about science fiction, and the authors that wrote stories for this short story collection were asked to imagine Iraq in 100 more years, and it was very, very interesting. The intro and the outro really explained what the mindset is of most of these authors, because they're in a world where there has been war for a very long time. It's kind of difficult, as you can imagine, for them to escape that world and to really make something else. And that was very well shown with all of these stories, that they still had very much this darkness to them. It was still a lot about war. And Paula and I talked about this, that the stories themselves weren't fantastic. There were one or two that were interesting and well worked out, but most of them had interesting premises, but the actual execution kind of left us with a bit of a had more potential. But a very, very interesting book, especially for the message that it has. But again, I'll talk about it more in another video. Then I've also read quite a few French books. I started with Horla by Guy de Maupassant. This is a short story collection-ish by Guy de Maupassant, who is a French author, well-known author, and he's wrote a lot of short stories. And Horla is kind of a folktale-ish, horror-y. It's very short. This has 6 more other stories, and I haven't even read the other ones. But Horla is about a man who discovers that in his house there is this invisible creature that is kind of scaring everybody, and he gets to know more about the creature. One of the things that I appreciated with this book is because this is one of the books that is made for children who study it in school. There were, after every few pages, there were some questions that you could get to, and those questions, they're questions like, oh, well, look at that passage, and what does this say about the main character, and what kind of foreshadowing is there, etc., etc. And those are things that I usually don't really pick up on unless I'm really paying attention, which usually I am not. And that, I don't know, especially because it was a short book, I kind of appreciated doing that a little bit more. It improved my reading of it. I'd recommend you reading the Horla if you like folktale, horror-y folktales like this, and you're looking for something that might come from another country, like France. And still in France, I've read 2 books of this trilogy by Madeleine Mansiet-Berthaud, and it is the trilogy of Les Cagots d'Aquitaine, the Cagots of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a region in the southwest of France, Bordeaux-ish, and more to the south of that. And the Cagots were, so this is historical fiction, and it is about these people, the Cagots, and they were believed to be descendants of people who had lepra, and that still were contagious. So these people were discriminated against very harshly, and they weren't allowed to touch things that other people were going to touch. They had to wear shoes at all times because people believed that if they walked over a piece of ground or whatever that a Cagot had previously walked upon with bare feet, they would then get ill. And they had to, there were no physical things that you could recognize a Cagot by, other than that they were smaller and more underfed, because this was a period in time, this is the 17th century, where it was very hard to eat every day, and as Cagots they weren't allowed to share food with others, to sell their food to others, so for them it was even harder. So they were skinnier, but apart from that they just had to wear a red goose paw on their clothes to be recognized. And so this story is about a young Cagot man who they lived in a community that is then separate from the rest, and he is a gardien des sables, which is the name of the first book. A gardien des sables is the guardian of the sand, and what he does is, in this region there are a lot of quicksandy areas, and what he does is, and from what I understood, he takes care of this area and makes sure that the sand doesn't take over villages, that rivers keep flowing in the same direction and whatnot, because otherwise the river might take over some villages and stuff like that. He's taking care of the June-ish area, which was interesting. And through his eyes you see all of the things that happens to his community and the traditions at the time. It's not only about this discrimination, it's also about living in the 17th century, also what happens to other people, and the traditions that they had at Cagots. And because of the discrimination he kind of wants to leave, and he ends up also doing that at the end of the first book. This is not really a book that you can spoil that much, because you know he's going to leave, and when he leaves he meets a young woman who has had terrible things happen to them, and they start to travel and settle somewhere for a while. That's kind of what happens in the second book. And the king at one point decides that it's not okay to discriminate against Cagots anymore, and the Cagots have to pay a fee, and then they aren't allowed to be used as serfs anymore. But as you can see in the book, there is a lot of resistance towards that from the people. There are a few people that want Cagots to have a normal life, that see them as normal people, but the majority does not have that and continues to discriminate. Despite these rules, you're allowed to say that person is discriminating me and they will get a fine, but that of course is not how the reality works. So that was very interesting as well. The book itself, the writing is just meh, and I felt the characters felt very flat, they're very one-dimensional. So I'm really appreciating to get to know this period and these people that are discriminated against for these reasons. I really like these kind of books that teach you about a certain era, but the story itself, the plot itself, the writing itself, that is not very special. But if you like these kind of informative books that still have a plot, then you might like this. I will say though, in this edition, it has been very badly edited, and there are sometimes characters that will have a different name in one sentence. I think that at one point the characters had other names, and for X or Y reason those have been changed, and they haven't been changed at every moment, so that was kind of, that threw me off, but it also makes it, I don't know, I kind of saw it as a challenge to see these moments. I've been talking for a long time. I still have the third book to read, and I don't know if I'm going to get to that in the last half of this month. I'll see about that. I also read The White Tiger by Aravind Adiga. This book has actually won the Man Booker, it still was, in 2008. And it talks about an Indian man who sends letters to the president of China to teach him about how he became an entrepreneur. And he is from a small poor village, and he becomes the driver of some rich people. And he talks about his relationship with these rich people. He talks about the caste system in India. I can see why a lot of people like this book, because it has interesting plot points sometimes. It has a rather pacey atmosphere for a book that doesn't really, I mean, not much happens, but it feels like a lot is happening somehow. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm still unsure as to what I think of this book. I think it does good things, but there's something... I felt like he was very offensive towards his own people. He was very denigrating. Is that a word? It's a word in French. It's a word in Dutch. Denigrerend, denigrant. Denigrating? Should make sense. It felt like he was very denigrating towards poor Indian people. And there was something that kind of... I didn't like because of that. But it's an interesting book, and I can see why there was such a buzz around it more than 10 years ago. A more recent book that came out is A Thousand Ships by Nathalie Haynes, and this one was came out last year, maybe the year before, and there was also a lot of buzz around this one, including being shortlisted for the Women's Prize and probably more. This is a retelling of the Trojan War and the Odyssey from the point of view of women. So I read another book that did the similar thing, which was The Silence of the Girls by something Parker, and that kind of failed at what it was trying to do, but this one did manage that. I love Greek myth retellings. It's completely my jam. I know the whole thing. I mean, I can start telling you about the Trojan War right now. I can tell you, yeah, I just love it. I love all the Greek gods. And I like this perspective on it, because the gods, for example, were presented as bitchier versions of the versions that I'm kind of used to, where they're noble creatures. You don't want to anger the gods. You're not going to present them as bitchy versions. It is told in an achronological pace, so it helps, I think, to already kind of know the story and already know what's going on. Otherwise, I'm not sure how clear everything would be, because it starts with the end of the Trojan War. One of the things that it keeps coming back to was what happens to the surviving Trojan women, the queen and a few of her daughters after Troy has fallen. And that brought a perspective that I didn't really know, so that I really liked that. Most of the characters in here are the standard women of Troy. You have got Clytemnestra, you have got Penelope, because it's also about the Odyssey. You have got the goddesses, you have got Hekabe, you've got... I don't think it's actually from Helen's point of view, because Helen is kind of a character. So you kind of know most of them. There were a few that I didn't know, including the wife of Aeneas, so I really liked her passage. Another thing that it does is that it says, hey, wars should not be only from the men's perspective, because women partake in them even if they don't fight. And there is a passage in the book that I want to read to you that talks about that. It's one of the passages where Penelope is writing to Odysseus. So it goes like this, so you can have also a little bit of an idea how the writing goes. The bards all sing of the bravery of heroes and the greatness of your deeds, yours being Odysseus. It's one of the few elements of your story of which they all agree, but no one sings of the courage required by those of us who are left behind. It must be easy to forget how long you've been gone, as you bound from one misfortune to another, always having to make impossible choices, always seizing opportunities and taking risks. That passes the time, I would imagine. Whereas sitting in our home without you, watching Telemachus grow from a baby into a child, and now a handsome youth, wondering if he will ever see his father again, that also takes a hero's disposition. Waiting is the cruelest thing I have ever endured. Like bereavement, but with no certainty. I'm sure if you knew the pain it has caused me, you would weep. You always were prone to sentiment. So yeah, that's the kind of thing you would see if you read this book. I highly recommend it if you like Greek retellings. I'm going to look for more Greek retellings as of this. So, those were all of the books that I've read in the first half of March. I have a slight problem now that, so these were 7 books, and I have this rule that I'm not allowed to read more than 10 a month, because that was what I did a lot of last year, and it just felt like I was reading too much. So I'm going to read still 1 book for Libya, and I have my book club book to read, and I still need to read a reread book, which already puts me at 3, and the choices that I have for that are normal size, so I think that I should, when I'm done with those 3, pick up a very big book that I won't have finished this month. I think that's going to be my system. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling. Have you read any of these books? What were your thoughts? I'd especially like to hear your thoughts about The White Tiger because I still really don't know what I think of it. And I'll see you guys in another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Ba-chum, ba-chum, chum.